A nurse had been hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state, whose life was about to end once the machines were disconnected. As the nurse approached the man, he was shaken by what he found. Liam Foster, a nervous 25-year-old just out of nursing school, adjusted the collar of his borrowed uniform. His hands, trembling, worked to smooth out the creases of the ill-fitting fabric as the elevator ascended to the penthouse of a towering, luxurious building. Coming from humble beginnings, the young nurse felt the immense weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. His mind drifted to his mother, who was fighting cancer in a hospital, while he was preparing to care for one of the city's wealthiest men. "You can do this, Liam. This job is your only chance to save Mom," he reminded himself, the pressure mounting. "It's how you'll afford her treatment. Don't mess this up," he whispered to himself, trying to steady his racing heart. As the elevator doors opened without a sound, Liam stepped into a grand entrance hall that left him speechless. Persian rugs covered the floors and priceless artworks adorned the walls, works that, combined, were worth more than he could ever hope to earn in his lifetime. A thick, almost suffocating silence hung in the air, making every step he took seem like an intrusion. Approaching the main door hesitantly, Liam raised his hand to knock just as it swung open. Standing in the doorway was Ivy Blackwell, the daughter of the millionaire. Her cold, appraising eyes swept over Liam, sizing him up from head to toe. "You must be the new nurse," she said sharply, her voice as icy as her gaze. "I hope you're more competent than you look." Liam felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment, but forced a polite, professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Liam Foster, here to care for Mr. Blackwell." He extended his hand, but she ignored it completely, turning on her heels and gesturing for him to follow her down the lavish hallway. "What am I doing here?" Liam thought, a wave of doubt crashing over him. "I don't belong in this world." Ivy stopped abruptly, spinning around to face him with a stern expression. Her sharp, icy blue eyes seemed to bore right through him. "Before we enter my father's room, let me make something perfectly clear," she began, her voice low and laden with threat. "This job requires complete discretion. Anything you see or learn in this house stays here. Do you understand?" Liam nodded quickly, feeling a lump form in his throat. She continued, her tone growing colder. "Any mistake, no matter how minor, will get you fired immediately. No second chances. Are we clear?" Ivy asked. Liam swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. Losing this job wasn't an option. His mother's life depended on it. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'll keep everything confidential," he said, his voice steadier than he felt inside. His mind raced, a mixture of worry and resolve. "I can't fail. Mom needs me. I won't let her down." Satisfied with his response, Ivy led him into the master bedroom, which looked more like a high-tech intensive care unit than a personal space. Liam's eyes widened at the sight of the array of state-of-the-art medical equipment, monitors, infusion pumps, and ventilators, all more advanced than anything he had encountered during his training at the university hospital. In the center of it all, lying in a well-appointed hospital bed, was James Blackwell. The contrast between the cutting-edge machines and the frailty of the man in the bed was stark. Once a titan of business, James now appeared small and vulnerable, his pale skin blending with the crisp white sheets. Tubes and wires kept him tethered to the machines that sustained his life, with every beep and hum a reminder of how precarious his condition was. Liam felt a wave of compassion for the man. He may be rich, but illness and death don't discriminate, he thought. Ivy's voice shattered the silence. Her tone now carried an emotion that Liam couldn't quite place. Perhaps a mixture of sadness and frustration. "My father's been like this for 3 months, she said. "The doctors call it a vegetative state, but we won't give up on him." She turned to Liam, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your job is to care for him, monitor his vitals, and report any changes, no matter how small." "Understood." Liam nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do everything I can for Mr. Blackwell." He moved toward the bed, beginning his checks on the various monitors and recording vital signs on a nearby clipboard. His actions were methodical, drawing on the training he'd received. As he worked, his mind couldn't help but wander. "If only I could do this for my mom." He quickly shook the thought away. Focus, Liam. One step at a time. As Liam carried out his initial checks, Ivy stood at a distance, watching him with her arms crossed. Her posture was rigid, as though she were scrutinizing every move he made, waiting for him to make a mistake. The silence in the room was only broken by the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the soft artificial sound of James's breathing. Liam could feel the sweat forming on his forehead, but he tried to stay calm. Deep breaths. You've trained for this, he reminded himself. After a few minutes of tense silence, Ivy spoke again, her voice softer this time. I'll leave you to get familiar with the equipment and routine. Dr. Delta Holloway, the family doctor, will stop by later to discuss things in detail. She paused, her gaze lingering on her father with a mixture of love and despair. Please take good care of him. He's all we have. With those final words, she turned and exited the room, leaving Liam alone with James and the steady hum of the machines. Alone now, Liam let out a long, shaky breath, allowing himself a brief moment of vulnerability. He studied James's face, once known in the media for his business prowess and strength. Mr. Blackwell, Liam whispered softly. I don't know if you can hear me, but I promise I'll do everything I can to take care of you. We'll fight to bring you back. Liam paused for a moment, feeling an unexpected sense of connection to the man in the bed. My mom is sick too. I understand what your family is going through. As he continued his work, adjusting equipment and making sure James was comfortable, Liam couldn't help but notice the wealth of personal details in the room. Family photos in elegant silver frames, a bookshelf stacked with books that looked untouched, and a window offering a sweeping view of the city that stretched to the horizon. It was a stark reminder of the life James had once lived, a life so different from his own. What must it be like to have all this? Liam wondered, adjusting a pillow. And yet, here he is, as helpless as any of us. Time passed slowly as Liam alternated between checking vital signs, administering medications, and providing basic care. Occasionally, he spoke to James, commenting on the weather or the silent news playing on the flat-screen TV. He had learned during his training that even comatose patients might respond to conversation, even if only on a subconscious level. Maybe you can hear me, Mr. Blackwell. If you can, I want you to know you're not alone. We're all waiting for you to wake up. It was during one of these routine checks that something unexpected happened. As Liam leaned over James to adjust the position of his arm, he noticed a slight movement, a twitch so subtle that, for a moment, he thought he was imagining it. James's fingers, which had been as still as the rest of his body, twitched ever so slightly. Liam blinked rapidly, unsure if his eyes were deceiving him. The fatigue and stress from his new job seemed to be clouding Liam's judgment. There was no way it could be real, he thought. After all this time in a vegetative state, it simply couldn't be. He muttered to himself, leaning in closer, trying to make sure. His heart raced, a whirlwind of excitement and fear taking hold. He knew he should inform Ivy immediately if anything changed, but what if it was just his mind playing tricks on him? He couldn't afford to appear incompetent or create false hope. Mr. Blackwell? He called softly, his voice shaky with anticipation. If you can hear me, if you understand me, please try moving your fingers again. Holding his breath, Liam focused intently on James's hands, hoping for even the smallest sign. Every second stretched out, feeling like an eternity. Liam was about to convince himself that it had all been a figment of his imagination when it happened. This time it wasn't just a twitch, it was a clear movement. James's fingers slowly contracted, unmistakably. Liam felt his heart leap into his throat. Oh my God, he whispered, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He's responding. He's actually responding. The emotion surged within him, a mix of joy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't tear his gaze away from James's hands. Liam moved even closer, his face just inches from the patient. He needed to be certain before he contacted the family or the doctors. Mr. Blackwell, if you can hear me, please squeeze my hand, Liam said, his voice more urgent now, as he gently placed his hand in James's. What happened next would stay with him forever. James's hand, which had been lifeless moments before, suddenly came to life. His fingers closed around Liam's wrist with surprising, almost terrifying strength. The shock was so intense that Liam almost cried out in surprise. He instinctively tried to pull away, but James's grip was firm, almost desperate. Then James's eyes, once closed and unresponsive, snapped open, filled with an intensity that froze Liam in place. There was no mistaking it now. James Blackwell was awake, and more than that, he seemed to be trying to communicate with a palpable urgency. A cold shiver ran down Liam's spine, a combination of fear and exhilaration. Oh my God, he thought, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. What's happening? The strength in James's grip was surprising, especially considering he'd been in a coma for so long. Panic rose in Liam's chest as he struggled to break free. "Mr. Blackwell, please let me go," he pleaded, his voice shaking with confusion and fear, but James's eyes remained fixed on him, filled with a desperate intensity that Liam couldn't understand. His heart raced as he tried to stay calm, but his mind raced with questions. What is he trying to tell me? Why does he look so terrified, holding on so tightly? Sweat beaded on his forehead as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Liam continued to struggle, unable to make sense of the situation. James's face twisted into an expression that Liam couldn't decipher. Was it pain, fear, or something else entirely? Taking a deep breath, Liam tried again. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm here to help. If you can understand me, blink twice," he said with the most reassuring voice he could muster. But James's wide, desperate gaze remained fixed on him, and there was no change. Suddenly, just as abruptly as it had started, James's grip began to loosen. Slowly, his fingers relaxed until his hand fell limp back onto the bed. James's eyes closed again, and his face returned to the placid expression it had worn before. "Mr. Blackwell?" Liam whispered, leaning in closer. "Can you hear me? Please show me some sign if you're listening." There was no response. James lay motionless again, as if the entire exchange had never happened. Liam stepped back, his legs so shaky that he had to brace himself against the wall to keep from falling. His mind spun as he tried to process what had just transpired. Was that real, or am I losing my mind? He muttered to himself, running his hand through his damp hair, trying to steady his breathing. His heart was still racing, each beat reminding him of the overwhelming emotions he just felt. With unsteady steps, he approached the monitors, scanning the screens in search of any sign of change. But the numbers and graphs remained unchanged, showing the same steady patterns. This doesn't make sense. How could he have been so strong a moment ago? He muttered under his breath, frustrated. The whirlwind of doubts and possibilities clouded his mind. He knew he should tell Ivy, but a voice in the back of his mind warned him about the potential consequences. What if she doesn't believe me? What if I tell her and lose this job? He thought, his nerves tightening. My mom needs the treatment. I can't risk everything on something that might have just been my imagination or something that won't happen again. Biting his lip nervously, Liam glanced once more at James, who was now lying completely still on the bed. But what if it wasn't my imagination? What if he really did wake up, even just for a moment? The internal conflict raged on, leaving him paralyzed between his professional duty and the fear of what might happen next. After what seemed like an eternity, Liam finally made up his mind. With one last look at the motionless James, he turned and left the room, his heart heavy with uncertainty about what he was about to do. The walk to Ivy's office felt like an endless journey. When he finally reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. It's now or never, he thought, steeling himself. Gathering all his courage, he knocked softly. When a voice from inside called out, "Come in," he opened the door. Ivy was seated behind an imposing desk, her attention absorbed by a stack of papers. When Liam entered, breathless and pale, she looked up with an unmistakable look of irritation. Ivy's voice cut through the tension. "What is it now, Mr. Foster? Did something happen? Is my father okay? Because you look so nervous," she asked, her tone dry and laced with impatience. Liam took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His hands trembled slightly, and he quickly tucked them into the pockets of his uniform. "Mrs. Blackwell," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "Something happened with your father. He woke up for a moment. He grabbed my arm and opened his eyes. It was brief, but it was real. I swear on my life." Ivy's reaction was swift and icy. She stood up slowly, circling the desk with deliberate steps. Her eyes locked onto Liam with such intensity that he instinctively took a step back. The air in the office felt thick, heavy with tension. "You're telling me," she started, her voice dangerously calm, each word slow and deliberate, "that my father, who has been in a vegetative state for months, suddenly woke up, grabbed you, and then went back into a coma, all without any of the monitors registering any change?" She fixed him with a penetrating gaze, and Liam swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. He could see the disbelief and the anger beginning to flare in her eyes, but he knew he couldn't back down now. "I know it sounds impossible, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, doing his best to keep his voice firm. "But it's the truth. I saw it with my own eyes. Your father. He seemed to be trying to tell me something." Ivy moved even closer, invading Liam's personal space. He could smell the expensive perfume she wore, mixing with the scent of paper and ink that permeated the office. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice now heavy with threat, "let me be very clear. If this is some kind of prank or an attempt to get attention, you're in the wrong place. I won't tolerate false hope or emotional manipulation in this house." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "We're going back to my father's room now. And if this is all a fabrication of yours, consider yourself not only fired but also sued for unethical conduct." "Understood." Liam nodded silently, his throat tightening as fear gripped him. The thought of losing his job, and with it, the chance to provide his mother with the treatment she needed, weighed heavily on him. "God help me," he thought. "If she doesn't believe me, I'm done." He followed Ivy out of the office, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The walk back to James's room felt endless. Liam could feel Ivy's gaze burning into his back, filled with skepticism and irritation. The silence between them was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the marble floor. Liam's mind raced, scrambling to find a way to convince Ivy of what he had seen. What if it happens again while she's there? Maybe Mr. Blackwell can prove I'm telling the truth, he thought, a glimmer of hope stirring inside him. But then another thought followed. What if nothing happens? I'll be seen as a liar or worse, as someone trying to manipulate the family during such a delicate time. When they finally entered the room, James lay exactly as Liam had left him, motionless, pale, connected to the machines that kept him alive. The constant beeping of the monitors seemed to mock him, as if saying, "See? Nothing has changed." Ivy approached the bed, her eyes scanning the monitors with clinical precision. She checked each tube and connection, searching for any sign of change. After a few moments of tense silence, she turned to Liam, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Well? Where is this miraculous change you saw?" she demanded. "My father looks exactly as he has for the last few months." Her voice held a note of disbelief. Liam hesitated, his eyes darting between James and the monitors. Sweat began to form on his forehead as his hands shook slightly. I don't understand," he stammered, panic rising in his chest. The reality of the situation hit him hard. There was no proof of what he had experienced. "I swear he was awake," Liam said, his voice faltering. "His eyes were open. He grabbed my arm." His words trailed off as he realized how unbelievable his story must sound now. Ivy crossed her arms, her expression hardening further. "Mr. Foster, I warned you about discretion and professionalism when I hired you," she said, her voice laced with disappointment and restrained anger. "Making up stories and offering false hope is not only cruel, it's unethical." Liam's mind spun as he searched for an explanation, but he couldn't come up with anything that made sense. Could I have imagined it? He wondered. Maybe it was just an involuntary reflex. He voiced the thought weakly, even though he knew how ridiculous it sounded. Sometimes comatose patients have reflex movements that seem intentional. Ivy sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to ward off an impending headache. "Enough of these fantasies, Mr. Foster. I'm beginning to question your competence for this job." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to a threatening tone that made Liam instinctively step back. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice cold. "If you cause any more trouble or spread stories about non-existent miracles, your dismissal will be immediate. And believe me, I'll make sure you never work as a nurse in this city again." "Understood." Liam nodded silently, feeling defeated and overwhelmed. Ivy's words felt like a sentence, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He watched her make one last check of the equipment before leaving the room, giving him a warning glance as she passed. Once the door closed behind her, Liam turned to James, studying the older man's impassive face. "I know what I saw," he muttered to himself, doubt creeping into his voice. "I'm not going crazy, am I?" he wondered, the room's silence offering no answers, only more questions. Leaning over James's bed, he spoke softly. "Mr. Blackwell, if you can hear me, please give me a sign. Anything. I need to know I'm not losing my mind." But James remained motionless, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm dictated by the ventilator. The next hours blurred into a haze of routine and checks. Liam cast frequent, nervous glances at James, hoping for any sign of movement, but the millionaire remained completely still, as if the strange incident had never occurred. Liam carried out his tasks mechanically, his mind still replaying the events of the afternoon. He checked the vital signs, adjusted medications, and performed basic care, all while grappling with the nagging feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, he had imagined it all. As night fell, exhaustion took over. Physically drained and emotionally spent, he sank into an armchair by James's bed, rubbing his tired eyes. Maybe I really did imagine it. All the stress of the new job, the worry about my mother. Maybe it's affecting my mind more than I realized, he thought, feeling the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. He moved silently around the room, organizing the medications for the night shift, careful not to disturb the almost sacred silence that had settled. Then faintly, he heard raised voices coming from the hallway. Liam froze, his body tensing in an instant. He recognized Ivy's voice, and without thinking, he silently moved toward the door, his curiosity getting the better of him. The argument between Ivy and another person was growing heated, and soon, Liam could make out the second voice as that of a man. He knew immediately it belonged to Garrett, Mr. Blackwell's other son. Though James had never met him, the press had often mentioned his existence in articles about the mansion's owner. "You can't do this, Ivy. Dad deserves more time." Garrett's voice rang out with emotion. "We can't just give up on him like he's some failed business. I don't want them to pull the plug. It's absurd for you to just decide to end it after just a few more weeks. Give him more time, maybe there's still a way out." Garrett's words were filled with desperation, and Liam instinctively recoiled, as if he could feel the pain in his voice. Liam stood still, holding his breath, trying not to make a sound as the footsteps in the hallway grew louder. His heart raced so violently that he feared the pounding would betray his presence. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the argument between Ivy and Garrett came to a halt, and the only sound that filled the space was the rhythmic approach of footsteps. Sweat beaded on Liam's forehead, his mind scrambling for a way out. He wasn't sure whether to pretend to be occupied with some task or face Garrett head-on. Every second stretched like an eternity as he wrestled with indecision. "Stay calm, Liam. You haven't done anything wrong," he thought, trying to steady his nerves. Before he could decide, the door creaked open, and Garrett Blackwell stepped into the room. The man stopped short when he saw Liam, his eyes red and swollen, widening in surprise. For a moment, the two men locked eyes in tense silence, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. Liam's heart thudded in his chest, and he could feel the weight of Garrett's gaze, moving over him with a mix of confusion, suspicion, and something else, curiosity. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse, betraying the recent tears. His eyes scanned Liam from head to toe, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Liam's pulse quickened, a wave of empathy flooding him, mixed with the rising tide of panic. "I'm Blackwell's new nurse," he stammered, trying to find his footing. "I was just checking the medications for the night shift. You must be Mr. Garrett." He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean to intrude. I should have announced myself. I'm sorry." Liam felt his hands tremble, clutching the clipboard, as if it were a shield against the awkwardness of the moment. "Please don't fire me," he added, desperation creeping into his voice. "I need this job. My mother is sick, and this is the only way I can afford her treatment. Please, I didn't mean to spy on you." Garrett eyed him carefully, his gaze weighing Liam's every word, his silence more telling than any spoken response. The tension between them grew heavier, and Liam felt like he was sinking under the scrutiny. Then, surprisingly, Garrett's expression softened, the suspicion in his eyes melting into something resembling understanding. Maybe even a trace of hope. You heard our conversation, didn't you? Garrett asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The question wasn't accusatory, but rather, it was a plea for confirmation, an invitation to join him in his struggle. Liam hesitated. He knew that revealing the truth could cost him his job, but his conscience was clear. Garrett's pain mirrored his own, the desperate drive to save someone you love. After a long pause, Liam made his choice. He couldn't lie. Not now. Yes, sir, he said, his voice low but steady. I heard part of it. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just doing my job when I overheard. He paused, letting the words sink in. No matter what happens now, at least I've been honest. Garrett nodded slowly, processing the admission. For a brief moment, the hallway was completely silent, the weight of the unspoken between them almost unbearable. Then in a swift, unexpected move, Garrett grabbed Liam's arm and pulled him into a nearby alcove, away from the hallway's harsh lights. The urgency in his actions was unmistakable. I need your help, Liam, Garrett whispered urgently, his voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and determination. My father, he can't die like this. Ivy, she wants to give up on him. I can't even finish the sentence. I can't. I mean, we can't let her make such a drastic decision on her own. I know you took an oath as a nurse, so please, help me fight for him. His eyes were wide, pleading for understanding. Liam felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. He knew he was about to become entangled in a family conflict that could cost him everything. His job. And with it, the chance to help his mother. The ethical dilemma ate at him from the inside. On one hand, his professional duty demanded neutrality, discretion and silence. On the other, his conscience screamed at him to act, to help in any way he could, because a life was on the line. The anguish in Garrett's eyes was a reflection of the same fear Liam felt about his own family. Mr. Garrett, Liam began carefully, choosing his words with precision. I understand your concern, and I've sworn an oath to help. But I don't know how I can assist. I'm just a nurse, and I'm new here. My influence is limited, and I have a lot to lose. He paused, thoughts of his mother clouding his mind. Garrett squeezed Liam's arm tighter, his eyes burning with a mix of desperation and resolve. You're the only one who will spend enough time with my father to notice any change, he urged. I need you to be alert to any sign, no matter how small, that he's still there. An eye movement, a squeeze of the hand, anything. Please. His voice was low but urgent. He took a deep breath before continuing. I know I'm asking a lot, but think about it. What if it was your father in that bed? Wouldn't you do everything you could to save him? Garrett's words hit Liam like a punch to the gut, twisting his stomach in painful irony. Just hours ago, he had seen exactly the kind of sign Garrett was begging him to look for. The memory of James's hand squeezing his arm, his eyes open with desperate urgency, still burned in his mind. But revealing what he'd seen, after Ivy had so fiercely dismissed it, seemed like a dangerous gamble. Liam felt torn, trapped between his professional responsibility, his desire to help, and the very real fear that everything could slip away in an instant. Mr. Garrett, he began, carefully selecting his words, I promise you, I'm always alert to your father's condition. It's my duty as a nurse to observe and report any changes. He hesitated, trying to make sure Garrett understood the complexity of the situation. But I need you to know my position here is delicate. Your sister made it very clear that. Before Liam could finish, Garrett's voice cut in, urgent and filled with raw emotion. Forget Ivy for a moment, he whispered. What do you think? Honestly, is there any chance my father could recover? His eyes locked onto Liam's, a weight of hope and fear pressing down on them both. The question hung in the air, heavy with the son's desperation. Liam could feel it, the same kind of anguish that mirrored his own battle to save his mother. Liam closed his eyes for a brief moment, fighting an internal battle. His professional duty told him to tread carefully, not to offer false hope. But the image of James reacting, even if only for a few seconds, wouldn't leave him. That fleeting moment could be the turning point. Not just for James, but for his own future as well. With a deep breath, he opened his eyes and met Garrett's gaze. a mix of compassion and determination in his expression. "I can't make promises," Liam said softly, his voice low but steady. "Medicine doesn't have definitive answers, but I saw something today. Something I can't fully explain." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Garrett's eyes widened, a flicker of hope igniting within them. What did you see?" "Tell me everything," Garrett asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His grip on Liam's shoulders tightened with urgency. The intensity of Garrett's reaction caught Liam off guard, reminding him just how much was riding on this conversation. Liam opened his mouth to explain, to finally share what he had witnessed, feeling like this might be his chance to make a real difference. But before the words could leave his mouth, Ivy's voice sliced through the air, cold and sharp. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her high heels echoing sharply against the marble floor with each step. Each click of her heels seemed to mark the countdown to the end of everything Liam had worked for. The tension in the air thickened as Ivy's eyes blazed with anger, her face a perfect mask of controlled fury. "I should have known," she spat, turning to Garrett. "You're trying to influence the nurse, aren't you?" Then her attention snapped to Liam. "And you, Mr. Foster, I thought we'd made the boundaries of your position here clear." Liam's blood drained from his face, a cold fear spreading through him. He tried to pull away from Garrett's grasp, but the man's hold on him was firm, almost as though he were clinging to his last hope. "Please," Garrett began, his voice desperate, but Ivy interrupted with a swift gesture. Her eyes never left Liam, and he could feel the weight of her gaze, as if every word she spoke was chiseling away at his future. "Enough, Garrett," she said, her voice laced with finality, making Liam's stomach tighten. "We've discussed this. Your interference in family matters and blatant breach of confidentiality are unacceptable." Each word seemed to land like a punch to Liam's gut, stealing his breath. He felt the panic rise within him, threatening to swallow him whole. "Mrs. Blackwell, please," he pleaded, his voice shaking with fear. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just doing my job. Please, I need this job. My mother." His words faltered, realizing that revealing personal details would only make his situation worse. The fear of losing everything he had worked for tightened around him, but he steeled himself, forcing himself to meet Ivy's gaze. "Please just give me a chance to explain," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I promise there won't be any more misunderstandings." The silence that followed felt like an eternity, and Liam could hear the frantic pounding of his own heart in his ears. Garrett still held his arm, his grip unrelenting, as if afraid Liam might disappear at any moment. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Ivy opened her mouth to speak, her face set with unyielding determination. Liam braced himself for the final blow, knowing that this could be the end of his career, the end of his chance to help his mother. But before Ivy could deliver the words that would seal his fate, a loud shrill scream echoed through the apartment, so full of terror that it sent a chill down Liam's spine. The scream pierced the air like a knife and everyone froze, their faces going pale as they turned toward the source. "It came from Dad's room," Garrett whispered, his voice now a ghost of its former strength. His face had drained of all color. Liam recognized the voice immediately. It was the assistant nurse, who had just arrived for the night shift. His stomach twisted into knots, panic and adrenaline mixing in his veins. Without thinking, he broke free from Garrett's grip, his instincts taking over. He dashed toward the room, his legs moving before his mind could fully catch up. Bursting into the room, Liam was hit with chaos. James Blackwell, who had been still for so long, was now writhing in the midst of a violent seizure. His body convulsed on the bed, muscles seizing in uncontrollable spasms. The assistant nurse stood frozen in fear, her hands trembling as she tried, and failed, to restrain him. The monitors screamed, flashing urgent red alarms. Without a second thought, Liam took charge. "Stand back. I need space to work," he ordered gently, guiding the assistant nurse aside. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. "Stay calm, Liam. You've trained for this. Every second counts." With quick, decisive movements, Liam worked, rolling James onto his side to protect his head. "Get me the emergency kit and 10 milliliters of diazepam now," he called out to the nurse, his voice firm and commanding. The nurse, though visibly shaken, moved swiftly, grateful for the clear instructions. By the time Garrett and Ivy arrived at the doorway, their faces pale with shock, Liam was already deep into the procedure. "What's happening?" Ivy demanded, her voice shaking with fear. "Why is my father like this?" Liam didn't look up. "Please stand back and let me work," he instructed, not taking his eyes off James. The assistant nurse returned with the kit and medication, and Liam administered the diazepam with practiced precision. "Monitor his vitals and report any changes to me," he told her, his hands moving quickly, checking James's airways, adjusting his position, never allowing his focus to waver. Time seemed to stretch, each second drawn out by the relentless beeping of the monitors and Garrett's quiet, muffled sobs in the background. Sweat beaded on Liam's forehead, but he didn't dare take his hands off James. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell. Stay with me. You're stronger than this," he whispered softly, as the violent convulsions slowly began to subside. James's breathing, once shallow and erratic, began to stabilize, and a wave of relief flooded through Liam's body. But he didn't let up. He continued to work, keeping a watchful eye on the man's condition, knowing this could be the turning point, a moment of hope in the midst of uncertainty. "The vitals are normalizing," the nurse reported, her voice now steady with relief. Liam nodded, allowing himself a brief smile of satisfaction. "Good work," he told her. "Keep monitoring him closely." He then turned to Ivy and Garrett, who were watching with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "He's stabilizing," Liam continued. "But we need to call a doctor immediately." A few minutes later, Dr. Delta Holloway rushed into the room, his white coat billowing behind him as he entered. "What happened?" Dr. Holloway asked, already assessing the situation. "I received an emergency call from Mrs. Ivy. Can you brief me on what happened with the patient?" Liam stepped aside, allowing the doctor full access to James. He quickly and efficiently recounted the events, his voice clear and professional. "Generalized seizure, approximately 5 minutes in duration. Administered 10 milligrams of diazepam, and performed standard emergency procedures." Dr. Holloway listened attentively, his experienced hands examining James as Liam spoke. After a few minutes of thorough examination, Dr. Holloway straightened up, a thoughtful look crossing his face. He turned to Liam, his expression now one of approval. "Excellent work, Mr. Foster. Your swift and precise actions likely saved Mr. Blackwell's life." Liam felt a wave of pride and relief. He had done his job well. The doctor then turned to Ivy and Garrett, both of whom were anxiously awaiting any news. "Your father's condition is stable now, but we'll need to run further tests to understand what triggered this seizure," Dr. Holloway continued. "It could be a sign of increased brain activity, but I don't want to raise false hopes." Ivy, who had been maintaining an impassive expression, allowed her control to slip for just a moment. She walked toward Liam, her eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "Mr. Foster," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I owe you an apology." She paused, clearly struggling with the words. "Your actions today went above and beyond what we could have expected." She took a breath, as though fighting a silent internal battle. "You may continue working here, but understand that you will still be under close observation," she said, her voice firm. "I don't want any more intrusions into our personal lives." Liam nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. I promise I won't let you down." The next few hours passed in a blur. Tests were run, medications were adjusted, and constant vigilance was maintained over James's condition. Liam worked tirelessly, assisting Dr. Holloway and ensuring that James remained stable. What had once been an oasis of calm in the room had now turned into a frantic hub of activity. Nurses came and went, equipment was brought in, and test results were shared. Liam coordinated the entire process with a level of efficiency that surprised even him. "We need another scan," he demanded, his mind racing as he processed every new piece of information, adjusting the care plan as necessary. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Liam found himself alone in the room with James. The chaos of the past few hours had subsided, and the silence was a welcome change. He sank into a chair by the bed, exhausted but still alert. "That was a close one, Mr. Blackwell," he murmured, looking at the patient's now peaceful face. "But you're a fighter, aren't you?" Liam rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the weight of the day's events. His thoughts drifted to his mother, reminding him of the reason he couldn't afford to give up. No matter how difficult things get, we both have people to fight for, Mr. Blackwell. He smiled softly to himself, thinking of the love that surrounded James's family. Your children seem to love you very much, each in their own way. Let's not disappoint those who love us. As he straightened the room trying to restore order after the emergency, something unexpected caught his eye. Among the papers in a drawer there was an old photo album. Intrigued, he picked it up, feeling the weight of the memories contained within its pages. The leather cover was worn but elegant, with the name Blackwell embossed in gold letters. Perhaps this could help, Liam thought, remembering studies that suggested familiar stimuli might help coma patients. He moved to James's bedside and carefully opened the album. Mr. Blackwell, he spoke softly, I found some old photos. Would you like me to describe them to you? Liam began slowly flipping through the pages, describing the images to James as he went. There were pictures of a younger James with his family. Happy moments, vacations, birthday celebrations, and everyday life frozen in time. Look, Mr. Blackwell, this must be from Ivy's first birthday, Liam commented, describing a photo of a smiling baby with cake on her face. And here, is that you teaching Garrett to ride a bike? As Liam continued, he watched James's face intently, searching for any sign of reaction. And then it happened. It was so subtle that it was almost missed. James's eyes moved, following the photos Liam was showing him. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Blackwell, can you hear me? Can you see the photos? He called, leaning in closer, his voice thick with hope. His pulse quickened. This could be it. This could be the breakthrough they've all been waiting for. Feeling a surge of excitement, Liam decided to call Garrett. He knew he was risking a lot, especially after Ivy's warning, but this felt too important to ignore. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. Stay calm, Liam. This could be significant, but don't give false hope, he told himself. He quickly sent Garrett a message asking him to come to the room immediately. As he waited, he continued to show James the photos, his heart racing with the possibility that they might be witnessing the beginning of a miracle. Come on, Mr. Blackwell, show us you're still in there. Your family needs this sign, he whispered encouragingly. Garrett arrived within minutes, his face a mixture of anxiety and hope. He rushed into the room, his eyes darting between Liam and his father. What is it, Liam? Has something happened? Has there been a change since we left? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Liam nodded, trying to keep his excitement in check, careful not to raise expectations too high. I believe so, Mr. Blackwell, he said, his voice steady. Your father. I think he's responding to the photos. He started flipping through the album again, narrating each picture as he had before. His eyes flicked between the images and James's face, anxiously waiting for a repeat of the earlier movement. But to his frustration and confusion, James remained still. No eye movement. No sign of recognition. The hope Liam had felt only moments earlier began to fade as the silence stretched on. The room seemed quieter now, the tension hanging heavily in the air. Liam continued showing the photos, his voice growing increasingly anxious as he turned the pages. Look, Mr. Blackwell. Here you are at Ivy's wedding. Do you remember that day? But James remained unresponsive, his face a calm mask that now seemed to mock Liam's fleeting hopes. Garrett, who had been watching intently, let out a soft sigh, his hopeful expression slowly turning to disappointment. The light of hope in Garrett's eyes gradually faded, replaced by a deep sadness that Liam could almost feel physically. The weight of the emotion seemed to settle in the room like a heavy fog. Finally, Garrett placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, gently interrupting his frantic narration. He turned to the young nurse, his eyes a complicated mix of emotions, sadness, frustration, and what hurt Liam the most. A flicker of suspicion. Liam, Garrett said, his voice weary and defeated. I understand you want to help, but are you sure about what you saw? There doesn't seem to be any reaction now. Liam's stomach sank. The disappointment on Garrett's face hit him like a physical blow. He knew what he had seen. He had felt it, had witnessed it with his own eyes, but how could he prove it? How could he convince Garrett, when the evidence had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared? "I swear, Mr. Blackwell," Liam said, his voice thick with desperate conviction. He was responding. "I wouldn't make something like that up. Please believe me." Garrett's gaze remained fixed on him, silently assessing. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the steady beep of the monitors, a cruel reminder of James's unchanging condition. In the days that followed, Liam became almost obsessively dedicated to proving that James Blackwell was still present, trapped inside his own body. Every free moment was spent trying to stimulate any kind of response from the patient. The hours seemed to drag on as Liam spoke incessantly to James, describing the weather outside, the latest news, even recounting soccer games he learned were James's favorites. His hands, callous from constant work, flipped through family albums over and over, hoping to provoke the subtle eye movement he had witnessed before. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell, I know you're in there," he murmured, his voice hoarse from so much talking. As the days passed, Liam expanded his efforts. He brought in a small portable radio, playing James's favorite songs, classical jazz as he had learned from Garrett. The soft melodies filled the room, but still there was no change. Liam watched the monitors for any fluctuation in heart rate, desperately searching for a sign, but James remained motionless, his eyes closed, his face a serene mask that seemed to mock Liam's frantic efforts. The frustration within Liam grew with each passing day, but it was tempered with a fierce determination. "I won't give up on you, even if it's the last thing I do in this job," he promised softly, gently adjusting James's pillow. The tension in the apartment continued to build, each passing day bringing the looming deadline for turning off the machines closer, like a storm on the horizon, casting a shadow over everyone. Ivy, increasingly irritable, could be found in her father's room, her presence marked by cold stares and sharp words. Liam could feel the weight of her scrutiny every time he entered. "Mr. Foster, I hope you're not feeding my brother false hopes," she would say, her voice as sharp as a razor. Liam swallowed hard, forcing a professional smile. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Blackwell," he would respond. Nothing more, nothing less. Garrett, on the other hand, became an emotional roller coaster. There were moments when he would enter the room with a beaming smile, convinced that he had seen a movement, a blink, anything, that might indicate his father was coming back. "Liam, did you see that? I'm sure he moved his finger," Garrett would exclaim, his eyes wide with almost painful hope. But those moments were always followed by periods of deep despair, where Garrett would sit silently beside the bed, holding his father's inert hand, silent tears streaming down his face. Liam watched these fluctuations with a heavy heart, knowing all too well what it was like to cling to the smallest shred of hope when a loved one was ill. As the deadline approached, Liam made a drastic decision. He knew he was risking his job, perhaps even his career, but he couldn't bear the thought of missing any opportunity to witness a sign of consciousness in James. Against Ivy's explicit orders, he decided to spend the night in the room. "Just an extra precaution. I want to make sure we're closely monitoring any changes over the next 24 hours, he thought, justifying his decision. Night fell over the city, the lights outside twinkling like stars. Liam settled into an armchair beside James's bed, determined to remain awake and vigilant. The hours dragged by, the only sound in the room the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and James's artificial breathing. Liam fought against sleep, his eyes burning with the effort to stay awake. He softly spoke to James, sharing stories from his own life, about his sick mother, his dreams and his fears. "You know, Mr. Blackwell, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm not just prolonging the inevitable. But then I think of my mother, how I'd do anything to save her, and I know I have to keep trying, for you, for your family," Liam murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. At some point in the early morning hours, Liam must have dozed off. He woke with a start, disoriented. Something had stirred him. An almost imperceptible sound. Blinking away sleep, Liam leaned forward, his eyes adjusting to the dimness of the room. That's when he saw it, something that made his heart stop. Tears, silent tears, were streaming down James's face. Liam held his breath, barely daring to believe what he was seeing. "Mr. Blackwell, can you hear me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. His hands were shaking as he reached for his cell phone, desperate to document this moment, desperate for proof. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the phone, trying to turn it on. but the screen remained dark. No matter how many times he pressed the power button, nothing happened. No, 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 he muttered, pressing harder, frustration and panic rising in his chest. His phone's battery had died completely. Liam felt a wave of frustration and despair wash over him. Here it was, the proof he had been searching for, and he had no way to record it. Damn it, this has to work, he whispered to himself, fighting the urge to throw the phone against the wall, trying to calm his racing heart. He turned back to James, the tears still falling down his face. A silent testament to the consciousness that everyone had assumed was lost. Gently, Liam took a tissue and wiped James's face, his touch soft and respectful. It's okay, Mr. Blackwell. I'm here. I won't leave you alone, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He held James's hand, feeling a deep wordless connection. We're going to show them you're still in there, Mr. Blackwell, Liam whispered softly, his voice filled with determination. We're going to fight for your life. Time seemed to freeze in that room as Liam remained at James's side, watching every breath, every tiny movement with intense focus. He spoke gently, words of encouragement flowing from him as if they could somehow reach James. You're stronger than this, Mr. Blackwell, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I know you can hear me. I know you're fighting to come back to your family. Don't give up now. James's tears eventually stopped, but Liam stayed alert, unwilling to miss any further signs of consciousness. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the curtains, Liam felt the weight of the night on his shoulders. He was exhausted, physically drained, emotionally spent, but his resolve had never been stronger. Now, he knew without a doubt that James was still present. The challenge was to convince the others, especially Ivy. Liam knew that without concrete proof, his words could easily be dismissed as the ramblings of a tired, emotionally invested nurse. How can I make them believe? There has to be a way, he muttered to himself, running his hand through his hair in frustration. Lost in thought, Liam almost didn't hear the soft click of the doorknob turning. His heart leaped into his throat when he saw the door slowly creaking open. For a moment panic surged through him, and he considered pretending to be asleep. But he knew that would only make things worse if he was caught, so he straightened up, bracing himself for whatever was coming. The door opened fully, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of Ivy Blackwell. Liam's blood ran cold. What was she doing here so early? More importantly, what would she do when she found him here, clearly defying her orders? Ivy stepped into the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. When her gaze fell upon Liam, sitting by her father's bedside, a mixture of emotions flickered across her face: surprise, irritation, and something else that Liam couldn't quite place. For a tense moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was only broken by the steady beeping of the monitors and the sound of James's artificial breathing. Finally, Ivy took a step forward, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the stillness. Mr. Foster, just what do you think you're doing here? Liam swallowed hard, his mind racing to find the right words. He knew this moment could determine everything. His job, James's future, maybe even his own career. Mrs. Blackwell, I know this looks irregular, but something happened tonight that you need to know about, he began, forcing his voice to remain steady. He paused, taking a breath before continuing. Your father, he cried, real tears. I saw it with my own eyes. He watched Ivy closely, trying to read her expression. Please believe me, he thought desperately. Ivy's face was unreadable as she took a few more steps into the room, her eyes flicking between Liam and her father's peaceful, tear-streaked face. Mr. Foster, she said again, her voice now tinged with a mix of skepticism and perhaps a hint of hope. I understand you want to help. She stopped, her emotions seemingly battling within her. Liam saw an opportunity to convince her, and seized it with both hands. I know how it sounds, but I swear on my life it's true. I tried to record it, but my phone was dead. Mrs. Blackwell, I know I don't have concrete proof, but please consider the possibility. What if your father is still in there, fighting to communicate? He rose from his chair, his voice filled with urgency. The silence that followed felt unbearable, the seconds ticking by like hours. Liam could hear his own heart pounding, deafening in his ears. Ivy remained still, her eyes locked on James's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea what you're doing, Mr. Foster? Hope can be cruel, she said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. If this is just your imagination or worse, some kind of manipulation to save your job. Liam felt a lump form in his throat. He stepped closer to Ivy, his voice steady but full of sincerity. I understand your fear, Mrs. Blackwell. But what if it's true? What if your father really is trying to come back to us? We can't give up on him now. Just as the words left his mouth, a faint sound broke the air. It was barely perceptible at first, but it grew clearer, undeniable. James Blackwell was groaning, a sound neither of them had heard in months. Both Liam and Ivy froze, their eyes widening in shock and renewed hope. The groan grew louder, more distinct and unmistakable. Liam moved quickly to the bedside, his voice trembling with emotion. Mr. Blackwell, can you hear us? He asked. Ivy joined him, gripping the bed rails tightly. Dad, we're here, she called, her voice choking with emotion. James's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved slightly, as if trying to form words. Liam and Ivy exchanged a glance of amazement. The impossible was happening right before their eyes. James Blackwell, the man everyone thought was lost forever, was showing undeniable signs of consciousness. Liam felt a rush of emotion, relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had believed when everyone else had given up. Now everything was changing. We just witnessed the start of a miracle, he said to Ivy, his voice firm and resolute. I think he's really trying to come back. Moments later, Dr. Delta Holloway arrived in the room with surprising speed. His face was a mix of professional skepticism and barely concealed curiosity. Liam watched anxiously as the doctor began running a series of tests, his heart pounding in both fear and hope. The cold stethoscope slid over James's chest. Bright lights were shone into his eyes. Verbal commands were given in varying tones. Each second felt like an eternity to Liam, as he alternated his gaze between James's impassive face and Dr. Holloway's concentrated expression. The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by the soft beeps of the monitors and the occasional murmur from the doctor. Please, Mr. Blackwell, show us something, Liam thought desperately, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. After what seemed like forever, Dr. Holloway stepped back from the bed, his face now a mask of professionalism. Liam's heart sank as he saw the doctor's expression. Subtle signs of disappointment and resignation were evident. The young nurse fought the urge to speak, to demand that the doctor search deeper, but he knew his place was to remain silent, waiting for the verdict that could change everything. Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Foster, I found no concrete signs of consciousness in Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Holloway began, his voice controlled, echoing in the silent room. The movements and sounds you witnessed are likely involuntary reflexes, which are common in patients in a vegetative state. The doctor paused, allowing the words to sink in, his eyes moving between Liam and Ivy, gauging their reactions. I understand the desire to see progress, but we must be realistic about Mr. Blackwell's condition. Liam felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Despair flooded his chest. He opened his mouth to argue, to insist that what they had seen was more than just reflexes, but the words died in his throat. Ivy's expression had changed completely. What had been brief hope now turned into a cold, calculated detachment. The light in her eyes was gone, leaving only the hard shell of her resolve. It was as if a curtain had fallen, hiding every trace of emotion behind a mask of businesslike efficiency. I understand, Doctor, Ivy said, her voice cold and final. In that case, I believe there's no reason to prolong this any longer. The machines will be turned off as soon as possible. Her words cut through the air, sharp as a blade, and they hung in the room, heavy and final like a death sentence. Liam felt panic rise within him, his stomach twisting with nausea. No, it can't end like this. Not after everything we've seen, he thought desperately. His hands gripped James's bed rail as if he could anchor the man to life with sheer willpower. Mrs. Blackwell, please, Liam said urgently. You can't make such a drastic decision now. What I saw tonight, the tears, that has to mean something. We need more time. More tests. His voice trembled with emotion, his words coming out in a rush of desperation. He looked to Dr. Holloway for support, but the doctor only averted his gaze, uncomfortable with the situation. Before Liam could continue, Ivy cut him off, spinning on her heels to face him. "Enough, Mr. Foster," she said, her eyes flashing with anger, a storm waiting to erupt. "Your obsession with my father's condition has gone too far. You're delusional. And worse, you're trying to influence me with your fantasies." Her voice was venomous as she took a step toward him, invading his personal space. "From now on, you are forbidden from entering this room without supervision. You will only come in to do your job supervised by someone else. If I hear one more word about miracles or signs, I won't hesitate to call security. Are we clear?" Liam felt as though he had been punched in the gut, the air fleeing from his lungs. He stumbled back, his back hitting the cold wall of the room. The weight of the situation crashed down on him. He was alone in his belief, now seen as nothing more than a madman clinging to false hope. He looked again at Dr. Holloway, seeking any sign of support or doubt in the doctor's expression. But the doctor simply avoided his gaze, his silence as damning as Ivy's harsh words. With a brief nod, Dr. Holloway withdrew, his footsteps echoing in the hallway, leaving Liam alone to face Ivy's fury. The young nurse felt a deep sense of defeat settling on his shoulders, but something inside him refused to give up. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said one last time, his voice barely above a whisper laden with pleading. "I swear I'm not making anything up. Please give your father more time. He deserves that chance." Ivy turned away without a word, her posture rigid, as if shielding herself behind an impenetrable barrier. She left the room without looking back, the sound of her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, hammering home the finality of her decision. For several minutes, Liam stood motionless, leaning against the wall, trying to process everything that had just happened. The room, once filled with tension and hope, now felt eerily empty and silent. The constant beeping of the monitor seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of how close he had come, and yet how far he still was from proving that James was still there. Slowly, as if moved by something beyond his control, Liam approached the bed. His eyes traced the serene face of James Blackwell, desperately searching for any sign, any glimmer of awareness, that he was certain he had seen before. "I won't let them give up on you, not like this. I may lose my job, but I won't give up on what's right," Liam muttered under his breath, his determination slowly rekindling as he clenched his fists. With hurried steps and a heavy heart, Liam left the room, his mind racing with possible solutions. He needed to talk to Garrett. Perhaps there was still something he could do, something that might reverse the inevitable outcome that seemed to be looming closer with each passing minute. He found Garrett in the office, a space filled with the heavy weight of family history and the empire James had built. Garrett was hunched over a pile of documents, his face drawn and weary, as though the burden of recent days had aged him beyond recognition. When Liam entered, Garrett looked up, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by resignation, as if he already anticipated bad news. "Liam," Garrett greeted, his voice tired and hoarse from sleepless nights. "What happened?" "I heard raised voices." Ivy sounded furious. Liam stepped forward, his words pouring out in a desperate rush, as though if he stopped speaking, the reality of the situation would crush him completely. He told Garrett everything, the tears he had seen, the sounds they had heard, Dr. Holloway's skepticism, and Ivy's cold, calculated decision. His hands moved frantically as he spoke, and his eyes pleaded with Garrett to believe him, to see the truth behind his words. "Garrett, I swear on my life, your father is still in there. He's trying to communicate, trying to come back to us. We need more time. We can't let him go like this, not when there's still a chance, no matter how small." Garrett sat in silence, his face an intricate mixture of hope, fear, doubt, and a profound sadness. When Liam finished speaking, Garrett let out a deep sigh, the sound carrying the weight of countless lost battles and the hopelessness of the past few months. He ran his hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture so reminiscent of James that it made Liam's chest ache. "Liam," Garrett said, his voice strained, "I want to believe you more than anything in the world. I want to believe my father is still with us, but I'm losing hope every day. With every test, every negative result, it feels like I'm losing him all over again. It's like watching him die a little more with every hour," he confessed, his voice cracking with emotion. Liam felt his heart ache in response. He knew that feeling, The agony of watching someone you love slowly slip away, unable to stop it. It was like reliving his own mother's illness, that suffocating sensation that no matter how hard you try, it's never enough. Can't we stop Ivy? Liam asked, grasping at any possibility. There must be some legal process to buy us more time? Garrett shook his head sadly, his gaze locked on a family photo on the desk, James young and full of life, his arms around a young Ivy and Garrett. She has the medical power of attorney. Dad trusted her judgment, he said quietly. Legally, there's nothing we can do. The decision is hers. The words hit Liam like a punch to the stomach. He stepped away from the desk, his thoughts racing for any kind of solution, any glimmer of hope that could change the course of events now seeming to unfold inescapably toward tragedy. Liam couldn't bear the thought of everything ending like this, especially when he was so certain that James was still there, fighting his way back. It felt like a desperate leap, but what else could he do? As he stood in the quiet of the room, his thoughts spun in circles, grappling with the risks and consequences. The conversation with Garrett had only solidified what Liam feared. There was nothing they could do legally to stop Ivy, but Liam couldn't accept that, not when James was still there, struggling to communicate. An idea began to form in his mind, one that was as reckless as it was daring. He would do it alone without involving anyone else. The stakes were too high, but if this was their last chance, he would take it. He couldn't just let James slip away, not without giving everything he had. Liam's plan was simple in its madness: use his lunch break to get James to a nearby clinic for a more thorough brain scan, something that might pick up brain activity the apartment tests had missed. It was risky, could even be illegal, but it was a shot at proving James was still there, fighting to come back. As Liam considered the consequences, he understood the potential cost. If he was caught, his job, his license, everything he had worked for would vanish. But when he thought about the alternative, about James being unplugged, and all that was lost in that moment, he knew there was no other choice. If there's even the slightest chance, I can't let it slip by, he told himself, his resolve hardening with each passing thought. He knew he had no right to ignore this opportunity. Liam's adrenaline began to build as he imagined the plan in action. He would use his authority to arrange the transport, claiming a routine exam that couldn't be done at the apartment. It had to be quick, discreet, flawless. There was no room for error, no margin for mistakes. But it was all he had, and as he ran through the plan in his mind, the weight of his decision settled on his shoulders. He was on the edge now, unsure if it would lead to salvation or ruin, but he couldn't back down. This has to work. This is James's last shot, and I'll do it alone if that's what it takes, he thought, steeling himself for what he was about to do. By the time Liam entered James's room, his heart was pounding in anticipation. He checked James's vitals, ensuring everything was stable before beginning the preparations. He moved with quiet urgency, disconnecting the non-essential monitors and organizing the necessary portable equipment. As he worked, he couldn't help but speak softly to James, as if his words might somehow reach him. Come on, Mr. Blackwell, I know you're still in there. Today's the day we'll prove it to everyone. If anyone comes to unplug you, they won't find you here. But if I have to take you to my house, to another clinic, anywhere, I'll do it. Liam's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the equipment, the enormity of his actions crashing down on him. If he were caught, it wasn't just his job at risk, it was everything he had worked for. He would lose his career, his reputation, and likely face legal consequences. Once James was ready for transport, Liam checked the room once more, ensuring no trace of his plans remained. His watch read just a few minutes until his official lunch break. The timing was crucial. It was then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of the private elevator rising. His heart skipped a beat. No one should be arriving now, he thought, his stomach sinking. Ivy had made it clear that they planned to disconnect James's machines as soon as possible, and the sound of the elevator was the countdown to the end of everything. Panic surged through him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of evidence he might have left behind. The transport cart, the equipment bags, everything had to be hidden, and quickly. He pushed the cart toward the room's closet with hurried, frantic steps, his heart pounding in his ears. Can't end like this. Not now, he thought, the adrenaline flooding his body as he tried to move faster. Liam heard footsteps in the hallway. Ivy's voice echoed down the corridor, accompanied by others he didn't recognize. His heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about his plan anymore. It was about James's life. With one final push, Liam managed to close the closet door, hiding all the equipment away. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Stay calm. Act natural. No one knows anything, he repeated to himself, adjusting his uniform and trying to maintain his professional demeanor. The door swung open and Ivy stepped into the room, leading a small group of medical professionals. Her gaze swept across the space before landing on Liam. The look she gave him, surprise mixed with suspicion, sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice colder than usual. "I didn't expect to find you here. I thought you said you'd only be here under supervision." Liam's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his panic. "There was no need, ma'am. I was just performing routine care," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Mrs. Blackwell, is there anything I can do to assist?" he added, his hands clammy but his face calm. Ivy studied him for a long moment, as though trying to see through the veneer of professionalism. Finally she nodded briefly. "We're here to finalize things," she said, her voice lower now, almost tender. "The family would like a moment alone with my father before we proceed." Liam felt a knot form in his stomach. This is it. It's really happening. He nodded, stepping aside to leave the room. But as he passed Ivy, she grabbed his arm, her grip tight and her voice low but fierce. "And Mr. Foster, don't even think about interfering. This is a family matter." Dr. Holloway stepped forward, his expression serious, the weight of his years of experience etched into his features. "Mrs. Blackwell," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Before we begin, I need to confirm that this is truly your final decision. Once we disconnect the machines, there will be no going back." Ivy paused, taking a long breath, her face a picture of resolve. "I'm aware of the consequences, doctor," she replied, her voice unwavering. "This decision has not been made lightly. It's what's best for everyone, especially for my father." Liam couldn't bear the thought of this being the end, not when he was so sure James was still there, still fighting to return. The hopelessness of it gripped him like a vice, mixing with a growing anger. How can she be so certain? How can she give up so easily? He thought, the questions burning through his mind. Before he could stop himself, the words spilled out of his mouth, raw with emotion. "With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice shaking, "I don't think it's what's best for Mr. Blackwell. He's shown signs of improvement, however small they may be. Can't we give him more time?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward Liam, some shocked, others filled with fury. Ivy's gaze darkened and she stepped toward him, her eyes flashing with controlled rage. "Mr. Foster," she spat, her voice venomous, "your opinion wasn't asked for. You're just a nurse, not a family member or the attending physician. So I suggest you stick to your duties, or leave immediately." Her words were a sharp, cutting threat. Just as Liam felt the weight of her anger pressing down on him, the door opened again and Garrett walked in. His pale, tense face scanned the room, and the alarm in his eyes grew as he took in the scene. "What's going on here? Why are there so many people? Ivy, what are you doing?" His voice quivered with confusion and fear. Ivy softened just slightly as she turned to her brother. "Garrett, you arrived just in time to say goodbye," she said calmly, though the words hit like daggers. "We're about to let Dad go." Garrett's eyes widened, disbelief flooding his face. "No, you can't do that," he shouted, rushing toward his father's bed. "Not without consulting me. He's my father too." He turned to Liam, desperation in his eyes. "You don't agree with this, do you? Tell me you don't agree with this." Liam felt a wave of relief wash over him, finally having an ally in the room. "No, Mr. Blackwell," he said, shaking his head. "I don't agree. I believe your father still has a chance. He's shown signs of improvement, small but significant. If we could just give him more time." "Enough," Ivy roared, cutting him off. "Liam Foster, you're fired. Leave this room immediately. Your interference in family matters is unacceptable. I've given you too many chances already. Enough is enough." Get out of my house. Her voice shattered the air like glass, and Liam felt the punch of her words deep in his chest. Being fired meant losing not just his job, but the chance to help his own mother. The room was thick with tension, the air so heavy it felt suffocating. Garrett stood frozen, caught between his love for his father and the reality of what was happening. Ivy, he said quietly, his voice cracking, what if Liam is right? What if Dad really does have a chance? Can't we at least consider giving him more time? Ivy laughed bitterly, pulling away from Garrett's touch as if it burned. You too, Garrett? She asked, her voice hard. Don't you see? This is just prolonging the inevitable. Dad wouldn't want to live like this, dependent on machines with no quality of life. We're being selfish keeping him here. She paused, her eyes cold as she continued. Besides, I'm his medical proxy. There's nothing you can do. And Dad was right about that. You're delusional to think there's any chance left. The doctors have said they've done everything they can. This is delaying the inevitable. The room erupted into heated words and accusations, but Liam remained silent, slowly walking toward James's bedside. He could feel the eyes of the medical team on him, pity and disapproval radiating from them, but it didn't matter. All that mattered now was James. Mr. Blackwell, Liam whispered, leaning in close. I know you can hear me. I know you're fighting to come back. Please give us a sign. Anything. Your family is here. They need you. Don't give up now. Not when we've come this far. The voices behind him continued to rise, Garrett pleading for more time, Ivy firm in her resolve, and Dr. Holloway attempting to mediate, though his discomfort was clear. Please, Dr. Holloway said, his voice professional but strained. I understand this is a difficult decision, but we need to think about what's best for the patient. Ivy raised her hand, cutting him off. Enough, she said sharply. Let's say goodbye. It's the least we can do for Dad before we let him go. Her voice trembled with emotion, the finality of her words making Liam's heart sink. The room fell silent, thick with grief and unspeakable weight. Ivy approached the bed, taking James's hand in hers. Her tears began to fall freely, finally breaking the facade she had so tightly held together for so long. Dad, you've always been my rock, she said, her voice cracking. I know we didn't always agree, and I was often stubborn, but I want you to know how much I love and admire you. You taught me to be strong, to fight for what I believe in, and that's what I'm trying to do now. I promise I'll take care of everything, the company, Garrett. You can rest now. Dad will be okay. Then Garrett knelt beside the bed, holding James's other hand as if it were a lifeline. Dad, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Know that I fought for you and I will fight until the last second. Forgive me for all the times I disappointed you, for not being the son you wanted me to be. But I want you to know that I've always loved you. I always wanted to be like you. Even when it seemed like we were on opposite sides, I've always looked up to you. His voice broke, and the words came out in a strangled sob. I'm going to miss you every day. Please, Dad, if you can hear me, know that I love you. Liam stood there, his heart breaking as he watched the agony on both Ivy and Garrett's faces. He wanted to scream, to beg for more time, to insist that there was still hope. But he knew his place. This moment was for the family. All he could do was pray silently, begging for a miracle that seemed more distant with every passing second. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, he murmured a desperate prayer to himself. God, if you're listening, please don't let it end this way. Dr. Holloway stepped forward, his expression grave and compassionate. We're ready to proceed. Is there anything else the family would like to say before we begin? He asked softly. Ivy and Garrett exchanged a glance, years of rivalry and misunderstanding slipping away as they faced the magnitude of the moment. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, all the tension that had existed between them vanished. They shook their heads, their words lost to the weight of what was about to happen. The doctor approached the life support controls, his hand hovering over the master switch. Liam felt his pulse quicken, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. This was it, the point of no return. Without thinking, he began to pray fervently, his words a silent plea from his heart. Please God, we need a miracle. I know I don't pray as much as I should, but please help James, he begged in his mind, the prayer filled with raw faith and sincerity. Dr. Holloway looked to Ivy, seeking her final confirmation. The moment stretched out before Liam, each second feeling like an eternity. And then Ivy nodded. The gesture was slow, deliberate, like time had momentarily frozen. It was now or never. He couldn't stand by and watch this happen without one last desperate attempt. Wait! Liam's voice rang out, breaking the stillness of the room. Every head turned toward him, shock and disbelief painted on their faces. But he didn't care. Ignoring the stunned silence, Liam leaned over James's bed. His voice low and urgent, charged with every ounce of emotion and hope he'd been holding on to for weeks. "Mr. Blackwell," he whispered, his words trembling with intensity. "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Please give us a sign. Anything. Your family is here. They need you. Fight, Mr. Blackwell. Fight with everything you've got. Show us you're still here. There's still hope." The room was deafeningly quiet. Liam could feel Ivy's furious gaze burning into him, could hear Dr. Holloway's exasperated sigh, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on James's face, searching desperately for any movement, any flicker of life. "Please, I believe in you. Show them you're still here," he whispered again, so quietly only James could hear. Then it happened. At first it was just a faint hum, so soft it was barely perceptible. But then the sound grew louder, swelling into frantic beeping that sliced through the tension in the room like a hot knife. The silence had been shattered. Liam spun around, his eyes wide with shock, and his gaze shot to the monitor, which was now flashing with spikes of activity. The screen, once flat and lifeless, now pulsed with irregular but unmistakable patterns. James's brain, it seemed, was awake, sparking with energy no one thought possible. Liam's heart raced in disbelief as he took in the scene. This couldn't be a coincidence, not after everything that had happened. The once monotonous lines on the screen were now alive, dancing in rhythm as if trying to speak a long-silenced story. Trembling, Liam turned to Garrett, his voice catching in his throat. "Garrett! Look at the monitor!" he shouted. Garrett rushed to the side of the bed. His eyes locked on the flashing screen, disbelief growing in his face. His breath quickened as the truth began to sink in. "Oh my God, this is real," Garrett whispered, his voice trembling with awe. Liam nodded, barely able to contain his emotions. His voice shook as he confirmed, "It's brain activity. Your dad is responding. He's still here, Garrett. He's still fighting." Both of them stood there, transfixed by the sight in front of them. Time seemed to stop as they watched the evidence of James's brain activity unfold. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, once a grim reminder of his fragile condition, now filled the room like a chorus of hope. Garrett clasped his father's hand, his face drenched in tears, each one carrying years of regret and pain. "Dad, you're in there, aren't you? You're fighting to come back to us. Please keep fighting. We're here waiting for you," he whispered, his voice choking with emotion. Liam placed a comforting hand on Garrett's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through him. His own voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "Dr. Holloway, please confirm this," Liam urged, unable to look away from the monitor. "I think we're witnessing something extraordinary, something that defies everything we know." Dr. Holloway, who had been preparing to turn off the machines, moved closer to the monitor, his professional mask slipping, replaced by an expression of deep concentration and confusion. He studied the screen intently, his brow furrowing. "This is unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. His skilled hands quickly adjusted some controls, checking the data, trying to confirm what he was seeing. It wasn't an equipment malfunction. This was real. Garrett stepped closer, his voice quivering with a mix of hope and fear. "What does this mean, Doctor? Is my father waking up? Is he coming back to us?" Dr. Holloway raised a hand, signaling for patience. His eyes flickered with a glimmer of scientific excitement but remained measured in his response. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Blackwell," he said cautiously. "These patterns are certainly unusual for someone in a vegetative state, but we need to run more tests before we can draw any conclusions." He turned back to James, continuing his examination with focused precision, checking his vitals and observing every fluctuation on the monitors. His movements were deliberate, as though every second counted now. The human brain is still largely a mystery, Dr. Holloway continued, his voice steady but tinged with the faintest trace of curiosity. But this is intriguing. Liam couldn't help himself. Doctor, he asked, his professional curiosity overtaking his anxiety, have you ever seen anything like this before? Anything that might give us a glimpse of what to expect? Dr. Holloway paused, considering the question carefully. He turned his eyes to Liam, an expression of caution and fascination in his gaze. Honestly, Mr. Foster, he admitted, not with this intensity. I've seen patients show signs of brain activity, but nothing as pronounced as this. It's extraordinary. He then turned to Garrett, his tone shifting slightly, though still measured. But we must be cautious. We need further tests, and even then we cannot be sure of the outcome. But for now, this is something worth exploring. Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Holloway said, his voice firm as he looked at the team. I'd like to run a full battery of tests immediately. Prolonged EEG, functional MRI, stimulus response tests. We need to fully understand what's happening here. Every minute counts. The shift in the room was palpable. What had once been a place of quiet mourning was now filled with a nervous, almost tangible energy. Nurses rushed to prepare the necessary equipment, their voices a quiet murmur, urgent but hushed. Ivy, who had been silent up until this moment, looked visibly stunned by the turn of events. Her emotions, which had been locked away in resignation, now battled between anger, confusion, and something else. A flicker of hope she seemed desperate to suppress. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. I thought we'd agreed to let him go. Why are we doing this? Why are we prolonging this? Her gaze swept over the room, her disbelief evident. The last sentence faltered as if she were fighting an internal battle she didn't want to face. Garrett, who had been standing by, watched the scene unfold. The years of strained tension between him and Ivy seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a powerful unspoken desire for hope. His voice, though shaky, was filled with newfound conviction. Ivy, don't you see? Dad's showing signs of brain activity. He might be coming back to us. This changes everything. His voice cracked with hope, and in an almost childlike gesture he grasped Ivy's hands, as if trying to physically transfer his belief to her. Think about it. What if we can have more time with him? What if we get to say all the things we never said? Ivy froze, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. The iron mask of control she'd carried for so long began to crack, exposing a rawness beneath. What are you talking about? She snapped, her voice harsh. This is impossible. It must be a malfunction. Or worse. She turned to Dr. Holloway, demanding an explanation, her words laced with accusation. Doctor, what's going on here? This can't be real, can it? Someone must have tampered with the machines. Maybe just to give us false hope. The sentence hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dr. Holloway hesitated, clearly caught in the emotional tide. But he gathered his thoughts before speaking. Mrs. Blackwell, I understand your confusion and skepticism. Believe me, as a doctor, my first instinct is also to find a logical explanation. But what we're seeing here is unusual brain activity. I can't yet explain it, but I assure you, it's not a malfunction. This is real, though still unexplained. We need further tests to understand it fully. He spoke carefully, his voice neutral but firm. Liam, sensing the need to intervene, stepped forward. He understood Ivy's skepticism, but knew that this could be the moment they'd been waiting for. Mrs. Blackwell, he said calmly, his voice professional yet filled with quiet urgency. I know this seems impossible. Believe me, I'm as shocked as you are. But it's true. The monitor is showing spikes of activity that don't match your father's previous condition. Dr. Holloway agrees. It's highly unusual, and he wants to run more tests. This could be the chance we've been waiting for. This could be the chance your father was waiting for. He paused, his next words carefully measured. Think of it as one final opportunity to be sure. If after all the tests nothing changes, then we'll know we did everything we could. But what if there's even the smallest chance? Don't we owe that to your father? Ivy's eyes flickered between Liam and Garrett, her expression a battleground of conflicting emotions. For a moment, it seemed like she might reconsider, but then her face hardened again, her posture bracing for another blow. You too? she asked, her voice low and cold, as if she couldn't fathom it. What did you do, Liam? Tampered with the equipment, didn't you? All to prolong this, to make me look like the villain? As if I wanted my own father to die. Her voice dropped dangerously, each word biting with a deep-seated fear and frustration that seemed to fuel her anger. The accusation hit the room like a slap, suffocating the fragile hope that had just begun to bloom. Garrett recoiled, his face stunned and hurt. Ivy, how could you think that? We're all here for Dad's sake. No one's trying to make you look like anything. This is about giving Dad a chance. It's bigger than our issues, bigger than any past resentment. This is about giving him a shot, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Liam, though seething inside, forced himself to remain calm. He knew this wasn't the time to lose control. The situation was too fragile. Mrs. Blackwell, he said, his voice steady, but with a palpable weight of sincerity. I understand how hard this is to believe. The stress is immense, and emotions are running high for all of us. But I swear to you, on my own mother's life, that no one tampered with anything. Dr. Holloway was here the entire time. He can confirm this. He looked directly at Dr. Holloway, his plea silent but urgent. What we're seeing is real, no matter how inexplicable it seems. Dr. Holloway, sensing the room teetering on the edge of chaos, stepped in to calm things. His voice was calm yet commanding, the authority of a seasoned doctor cutting through the tension. Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Foster, please, I understand the emotions here. I understand the stakes, he said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. But we need to stay calm. I strongly recommend suspending any decision about removing life support until we can run further tests and understand what's happening with Mr. Blackwell. I know this is difficult. It's a compassionate concern you have, Mrs. Blackwell. But as his physician, I must advise that we explore this unexpected possibility before making any final decisions. He turned to Ivy, his tone softening slightly, yet his words still held the weight of medical protocol. After comprehensive testing, if there's no significant change, then we'll reconsider. But for now we need to be sure. Ivy stood there torn. The strain of months of stress and responsibility weighed heavily on her, making it difficult to embrace this sudden shift. The vulnerability in her eyes flickered, but she quickly masked it. But what if this is just a reflex? She asked softly, her voice betraying the doubt she could no longer hide. What if we're just prolonging the inevitable, making him suffer more? I can't bear the thought of giving everyone false hope only to. Before she could finish, Garrett interrupted, his voice pleading, thick with emotion. Ivy, please. Think about it. We owe it to Dad to give him a chance. This is bigger than everything we've been through. We have to fight for him. Ivy, please, Garrett pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. It's just a little more time. If there's even the smallest chance, shouldn't we take it? Think of all the things we'd want to say to him, all the apologies we'd want to make. What if we could have that chance? Ivy, still holding her ground, shot back, her voice quivering but resolute. You don't understand, Garrett. It's cruel to keep this going. What if he's suffering? What if he's trapped in there wanting to leave and we're holding him here? This isn't kindness. Liam, trying to mediate, stepped in with a mixture of professionalism and personal conviction. I've seen patients defy the odds, Garrett. Recoveries that seemed impossible. And as someone with a sick loved one, I understand the fear of clinging to false hope. He paused, ensuring his words landed with sincerity. But I also know that the regret of not trying everything can haunt you forever. Delta Holloway joined the conversation, trying to keep some scientific objectivity amidst the emotional storm. The patterns we're seeing suggest some level of cognitive activity. I can't promise a full recovery, but this certainly warrants further investigation. It's not a malfunction. The air was thick with tension, voices rising as emotions spilled over. The years of repressed fears, unspoken words, and buried hopes were suddenly laid bare. The room, once a place of solemn resignation, was now charged with a chaotic, raw energy. But amidst the heated debate, no one initially noticed the subtle changes that were happening in the bed. James's eyelids, which had been closed for so long, began to flutter. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as time passed, the movement grew more pronounced. His eyes were roaming, moving beneath their lids, as though struggling to open them. Liam mid-sentence froze, his eyes locked on James's face. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Look at Mr. Blackwell." The room went silent instantly. One by one they turned toward the bed. Ivy brought her hand to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. Garrett, his face filled with disbelief and hope, leaned over the bed. His voice trembled with raw emotion. Dad, can you hear us?" he whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone held their breath, praying for a sign, hoping beyond hope. And then it happened. A low, raspy sound emerged from James's throat, a guttural, desperate effort to communicate. It wasn't a word, but it was unmistakably real. The sound broke the silence like a spell, and the room was still. It was the sound of life, consciousness stirring against all odds. The moment seemed to stretch, timeless and fragile. The impossible was happening right before their eyes. James's lips twitched, trembling with the effort of forming words that had been locked away for so long. His eyes, though still weak, moved between the faces of his children. There was recognition there, something far more than just an involuntary reflex. Instinct kicked in for Liam, who moved quickly. He grabbed a cup of water and a straw that was on the bedside table, his hands shaking slightly with the emotion of the moment. He leaned over James, carefully offering him the water. "Mr. Blackwell, try to take a sip," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It'll help your throat." Liam helped James take a few small sips, each one a small victory. It was a step toward the impossible, a step that seemed to defy every medical expectation. The room remained silent, every person in it holding their breath, waiting for what might come next. Then, after a long pause, James's voice, raspy but unmistakably clear, formed a single word. "Wait." The room exploded with emotion. Ivy, who had remained so composed until now, felt her legs give way. She sank to her knees beside the bed, overwhelmed by the wave of relief and disbelief. "Dad, you're here. You're really here," she managed to say, her voice breaking with tears. Garrett, unable to hold back, let the tears flow freely. He leaned over, grasping James's hand as if afraid it might slip away. "Dad, we missed you so much. Please stay with us. Don't go away again," he sobbed, his voice thick with emotion. James's eyes moved slowly, but deliberately, between his children. His face, pale and weak, was filled with emotion and recognition. The years of absence, of silence, were being bridged in that single moment. "Dear." Holloway, though still in shock from the extraordinary turn of events, quickly sprang into action. His professional composure returned, and he began performing a series of basic neurological tests, his voice calm but now tinged with excitement. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to do some simple tests," he said, leaning closer to James. "Try to follow my instructions as best you can." He asked James to squeeze his hand, move his eyes, and try to lift his fingers. Each response, though slow and weak, was undeniably conscious. James responded consistently, his movements shaky but real. Liam watched, his heart racing. "This is incredible. He's really coming back to us," he thought, overwhelmed by the moment. After several minutes of examination, Dr. Holloway straightened up, a look of awe on his face. "It is with great joy," he said, his voice filled with amazement, "and I admit some astonishment, that I can declare Mr. Blackwell is no longer in a vegetative state. Though he is still very debilitated, and we have a long road ahead, he is definitely conscious and responsive." The impact of Dr. Holloway's words hit the room like a wave crashing through everything. Ivy's face crumpled as she sobbed in relief, her hands covering her face. Garrett, unable to contain his joy, laughed and cried at the same time. Liam, too, felt tears well up in his eyes, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. Ivy, still kneeling beside the bed, looked up at Dr. Holloway, then at Liam, her eyes red but glowing with relief. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely audible. I need a moment alone with my father," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Garrett, a silent plea in her eyes. "Just a moment, brother. I need to say some things." Garrett nodded, understanding, and kissed his father's forehead before standing up. "We'll be right outside. We're not going anywhere." Dr. Holloway gently ushered Liam and Garrett out of the room, leaving Ivy alone with James. As the door closed behind them, the doctor turned to the two men, his face filled with admiration and respect. Dr. Holloway placed a firm, warm hand on Liam's shoulder, his voice heavy with emotion. "Mr. Foster," he began, his tone thick with respect and admiration, "I must commend you. Your perseverance, your unwavering belief in Mr. Blackwell. It's nothing short of extraordinary." He paused as though carefully considering his next words before continuing. "In all my years of practice, I have rarely witnessed such dedication, such insight." The doctor's gaze softened as he spoke, his words hitting deeper than Liam had expected. "You didn't just care for Mr. Blackwell's body. You nurtured his spirit, kept the hope alive when all seemed lost." Dr. Holloway's voice became more impassioned as he spoke. "What you've done goes far beyond the call of duty. You've shown a courage and compassion that are rare to find in this world." He met Liam's eyes with deep sincerity. "You faced doubt, risked everything, because you believed in hope when no one else could see it. That is the true essence of care. It's seeing the potential for healing even when all seems lost. Hearing the faintest whisper of life when others hear only silence." The doctor's gaze glistened with contained emotion as he finished. "You haven't just saved Mr. Blackwell's life, you've given this family a second chance. A chance to heal, to reconcile, to say everything that was left unsaid. Your dedication reminds us all why we chose this profession in the first place. It's not just science, not just procedures. It's about compassion, empathy, and an unwavering belief in the human potential to heal." Dr. Holloway's words seemed to hang in the air, each one carrying a weight of admiration and gratitude. "Mr. Foster, you've embodied these ideals in a way that will inspire not just me, but everyone who hears this story. You have a rare gift. A gift that goes beyond medical knowledge. It's the ability to see the humanity in every patient, to fight for them when all others have given up." The doctor's grip tightened on Liam's shoulder, his eyes locked with his. "Never lose that, Mr. Foster. It's what makes you not just an excellent nurse, but an extraordinary human being." Liam stood there momentarily stunned. He had never expected such praise, and the weight of it left him speechless. A sense of pride and accomplishment began to swell in his chest, but it was tempered with profound humility. "Doctor, I only did what I thought was right," he said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't give up on Mr. Blackwell, not when I felt there was still hope." Garrett, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "Liam," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there aren't enough words to thank you for what you've done for our family. You've brought our father back to us." Before Liam could respond, a sudden cry rang out from James's room. It was a sound of shock and raw emotion, so intense it froze everyone in place. Without hesitation, Liam, Garrett, and Dr. Holloway rushed into the room, hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. What they found upon entering left them breathless. Ivy was holding James, her body racked with sobs. But these weren't the sobs of grief or despair. They were sobs of relief, the kind that come after months of pent-up emotion finally being released. The most astonishing sight, however, was James himself, weak but undeniably aware. His hand, trembling with the effort, was gently stroking Ivy's hair. The gesture was clear, deliberate, a father comforting his daughter after so many months of silence. It was a moment so simple, yet so profoundly meaningful. Liam felt his throat constrict as he watched, tears threatening to spill. He glanced over at Garrett, and saw the same awe and joy reflected in his eyes. Dr. Holloway, too, moved quickly to check James's vital signs. But even he couldn't hide the smile of wonder that crossed his face. In that moment, as the scene unfolded, something shifted in Liam. The struggle, the uncertainty, the fear of the past weeks, all of it felt worth it. The connection, the miracle unfolding before him, was more than just medical. It was human. Liam had not only helped save a life, he had helped reunite a family. Dr. Holloway's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the deeper meaning of his work. "This is why I became a nurse," Liam thought, his heart swelling with emotion. For moments like these, over the next few days, James's recovery remained slow, but each small victory was celebrated as a monumental achievement. Liam, now a permanent presence by his side, observed with a mixture of awe and professional pride as James fought to regain control over his body and his voice. It was on one particularly emotional afternoon that James managed to speak his first words. They came out halting, raspy, but filled with undeniable strength. "I was here all the time," he said, his eyes fixed on Ivy and Garrett. The revelation struck everyone like a lightning bolt. The realization of what James had experienced during those long months. Ivy in particular seemed deeply affected by her father's words. The stoic, efficient facade she had carefully maintained for so long seemed to crumble in that moment. As Liam adjusted James's medications, Ivy pulled him aside, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mr. Foster." "Liam," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to apologize. My behavior, my stubbornness. I was so wrong." Liam was surprised by Ivy's vulnerability, but he maintained his compassionate demeanor. "Mrs. Blackwell, you were only trying to protect your father and your family," he said softly. Ivy shook her head, a sad smile curling on her lips. "No, I was protecting myself. From fear, from pain, from the possibility of losing everything." Ivy's transformation wasn't limited to Liam. In an unexpected gesture, she sought out Garrett, extending her hand in a silent plea for reconciliation. "Brother, forgive me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have listened to you. I should have given hope a chance." Garrett, momentarily stunned, pulled her into a tight embrace. "There's nothing to forgive, Ivy. We're in this together." "We're in this together," Garrett murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he held Ivy close. "As we always should have been." Liam watched the scene with a quiet smile, feeling the profound shift not only in James's health, but also in the bonds that had long been strained between the siblings. James, though still frail, seemed to be gaining strength with each passing day. His drive to recover was matched only by his desire to see his children reunited, something that was now becoming a reality. On one memorable afternoon, James gathered enough strength to speak for a longer period. His voice was still raspy, but filled with the authority that only a father could possess. "Ivy, Garrett," he called, his eyes locking onto theirs as he gestured for them to come closer. "You are my legacy, more important than any business." He paused, taking a slow, labored breath. "Promise me, you'll work together as a family." The siblings exchanged a look, years of rivalry and unspoken resentment melting away in an instant. "We promise, Dad," they said together, their hands intertwining over James's. The room was heavy with the weight of their shared commitment, and in that moment, it felt like they had healed something that had been broken for far too long. Liam's tireless efforts had not gone unnoticed. One morning, as he was performing routine care, James reached out with a weak gesture, beckoning him closer. "Liam," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "You saved more than my life. You saved my family." Liam felt a lump form in his throat, moved by the acknowledgement. Before he could respond, Ivy entered the room, an unfamiliar smile on her face. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice now tinged with respect. "You're being promoted to head nurse of special care with a substantial bonus." Liam was momentarily stunned. The weight of this recognition, not just for his work but for his mother's treatment as well, hit him with full force. As the days turned into weeks, James began sharing more about his experience. His words, though slow and difficult, painted a vivid and harrowing picture of what it was like to be trapped in an unresponsive body, aware of everything yet unable to communicate. "It was like suffering without being able to speak," he described one afternoon, his eyes distant with the memory. "I could hear, feel, but I couldn't respond." Liam listened intently, his pen moving quickly as he took detailed notes. "Mr. Blackwell, your experience could help so many other patients," he said gently. "Are you willing to share more?" James nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with determination. "If it can help others avoid what I went through." "Yes." James Blackwell's story quickly spread beyond the hospital walls. Journalists crowded the reception area, eager for an exclusive interview with the man who had defied the odds. The medical community was just as captivated, recognizing the potential implications of James's case for patients in similar states. Dr. Holloway, now a leading figure in this research, coordinated the requests for information and studies, Mr. Blackwell's case could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and altered states, he told Liam during one of his rounds. As James regained strength, Liam found himself taking on a more central role in his recovery. No longer just a nurse, he became a confidant, a vital bridge between James and the outside world. One afternoon, James called out to him, his voice stronger than ever. "I want you to continue being my personal nurse." Liam felt a surge of pride and responsibility wash over him. "It would be an honor, Mr. Blackwell. I'll be here every step of the way." Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, James made remarkable progress. His speech became clearer, his movements more coordinated. The intensive physiotherapy, combined with his unrelenting determination, was paying off. One particularly memorable day, James managed to stand for a few seconds with the help of Liam and Garrett. The room erupted in applause, tears of joy streaming down everyone's faces. "This is just the beginning," James said, a tired but triumphant smile lighting up his face. As James's recovery continued, Ivy and Garrett began to work together to reorganize the family's businesses. What had once been a source of conflict now became a project of renewal and growth. Liam watched with satisfaction as he saw how adversity had forged a new dynamic between the siblings. "I never thought I'd say this, but working with Garrett has been surprisingly rewarding," Ivy said one day, as she reviewed some documents by James's bedside. Garrett, overhearing her, grinned widely. "Who would have thought, sister, that almost losing our father would finally make us understand each other?" The impact of James's story on the medical community was profound. Researchers from around the world began studying his case, eager to understand the mechanisms of consciousness and how it could affect treatment. Dr. Holloway, now considered one of the leading experts on the subject, often consulted Liam for his observations. "Your instincts were right, Liam," he told him during one consultation. "This could change the lives of countless patients in the future." Never underestimate the power of intuition combined with medical knowledge. As the months passed, the idea of creating a foundation to research altered states of consciousness began to take shape. James, now fully able to participate in the discussions, was the project's biggest enthusiast. "I want our experience to help others," he said at a family meeting. "No one should have to go through what we went through." Ivy and Garrett readily agreed, seeing the foundation as an opportunity to give new purpose to the family's wealth and resources. Liam, invited to participate in the discussions, felt deeply moved by the potential impact of the initiative. 6 months after James's miraculous awakening, the Blackwell family organized a special ceremony. The hospital's event hall was elegantly decorated, filled with healthcare professionals, journalists, and prominent figures from the medical community. At the center of it all stood Liam, still uncomfortable with the attention but deeply touched by the recognition. James, now able to stand for longer periods with the help of a cane, made a point of personally delivering the award to Liam. "This young man not only saved my life, but he also brought my family back together. His dedication and compassion serve as an inspiration to us all," James said, his voice strong and resonant, filling the entire hall. Liam, overwhelmed with emotion, stepped forward to accept the award with trembling hands. As he looked out over the audience, he saw a sea of familiar and new faces, all united by the incredible journey they had witnessed together. Among the crowd, Liam's mother stood, radiant and healthy, her treatment made possible by the bonus Liam's promotion had provided. Ivy and Garrett were standing side by side, their smiles genuine, reflecting the newfound harmony in their relationship. Dr. Holloway, standing off to the side, gave Liam an encouraging nod, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Thank you," Liam began, his voice thick with emotion. "This award is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us. Everyone who refused to give up, who believed in the power of compassion and perseverance." As Liam finished his speech, he made an announcement that would shape his future. He had decided to continue his studies, focusing on cases of altered consciousness. A profound sense of purpose washed over him, filling him with fulfillment and excitement. The journey that had started with a simple act of faith and compassion had evolved into something far greater. Looking at James, his family, his colleagues, and mentors, Liam realized that this was not the end but the beginning of something even more significant. A beginning full of possibilities, of lives that could still be touched and changed. A smile spread across his face as he thought, "This is just the first chapter of a much larger story. Each life is precious," he continued in his acceptance speech. "And every consciousness, no matter how hidden, deserves our attention, our care, and our unwavering hope." What began as an act of faith had blossomed into a revolution of compassion and understanding. May we never forget the power of believing in the impossible and fighting tirelessly for those who cannot fight for themselves. As Liam's words resonated through the hall, James, Ivy, and Garrett exchanged glances filled with pride and gratitude. What had started as a family tragedy had now become a legacy of hope and healing, one that would touch lives for generations to come. At the heart of it all stood Liam Foster, the young nurse whose compassion and determination had sparked a wave of change that no one could have predicted. The story of James Blackwell and Liam Foster stands as a powerful reminder of the transformative potential of compassion, perseverance, and belief in the inherent dignity of every human life. It teaches us that even in our darkest moments, the light of hope can break through, revealing new paths and possibilities that once seemed beyond reach. If you've enjoyed this story, we encourage you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support drives us to continue bringing these emotional narratives to you almost every day. Be sure not to miss the next incredible story that will appear on your screen. We are incredibly grateful for your presence here with us. Now, click on the links on your screen. We've curated a special selection just for you, filled with heartwarming stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.